Good day. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you for Reason to Resist from Montreal, Canada on December 10th, 2024. Today, I'm pleased to be joined again by Kervork Almassian. Kervork is an award-winning journalist and the host of Syrian Analysis, an independent political commentary channel. He's currently based in Germany, but is originally from Aleppo in Syria. Thank you very much for joining us today, Kervork.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity again, Dimitri.
So, Kervork, we had you on for the first time a couple of weeks ago, days before the fall of Bashar al-Assad. And before I get into the specifics of what has transpired since then, when you and I began chatting just before this interview, you shared with me some sort of philosophical commentary on the position you currently occupy in the Syrian discourse around the fall of Bashar al-Assad. And I think it's very important that people hear from you in that regard. What overall have you experienced in terms of your ability to convey to your fellow Syrians and others who are interested in the crisis in Syria? What have you experienced in terms of your ability to, speak truth to power, shall we say?
I want to make a disclaimer. I don't consider myself an intellectual at all, because I also learned from past experiences that intellectuals could be bought and sold at the same time. If you pay them enough money, they could sell everything. And they could sell also opinions and narratives to you. So I'm not that at all. However, I garnered lots of knowledge. I'm young, but I opened my eyes to politics from younger age. And I followed closely the Palestinian case, Iraq case, Libya case, Syria and Lebanon. And I'm very wary of foreign interventions in the region. And I know that our region is not perfect at all. And I know that our countries deserve so much better. And I know that our infrastructure has to get better. We need better roads, we need better salaries, we need better education, we need so many different things, including more political freedoms, press freedoms. I'm someone who studied international relations and diplomacy, political science. So even from an opportunistic point of view, I would benefit from freer Syria, right? But when the regime change war started on Syria, there was a war of narratives. So the narratives we were told in the press, which I'm always suspicious of because of the previous experiences in Iraq and Libya, and I learned about how much they manipulate the people. In the second Gulf War, they brought the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to give a false testimony, which created a narrative, an atrocity propaganda, to go to war against Iraq. October 7. So all these events, we know that such propaganda is always ongoing. So I started to dig in and I realized that Turkish intelligence, Saudi intelligence, Qatari intelligence, American, Jordanian and Israeli, mostly, they were the ones behind the arming, training and guiding the insurgents in Syria. Therefore, I argued and I said, guys, if these insurgents are going to overthrow the regime, the parties, the players supporting them, they have an invested interest in Syria. So they're going to come and slice the cake. So replacing Assad with these insurgents is not going to solve the situation, because Syria has been relatively sovereign in its decision-making, and we want to keep that. Okay, you want a better democratic system in Syria. I am not convinced that HTS or Nusra or FSA or NSA or all these different shades and forms of militant groups are going to establish a democratic state. Because if you read their literature, they say that they want to establish either an Islamic state, a constitutional Islamic state, or an Islamic caliphate. Therefore, I said that these groups aren't going to bring democracy or human rights to Syria. And this means I am against this revolution, and accordingly, I am labeled as an Assadist, right? Someone who supports Assad. But my arguments were factual and objective. And now that Assad has been overthrown, and we are seeing already two things going in parallel. One, the foreign powers who funded and supported these groups are slicing the cake. Israel is already inside Syria, occupying large swaths of territories, occupying the higher hills in Al-Qunaytira, and also destroyed all of Syria's strategic stockpile, air defenses, and the navy. So Israel already took the opportunity to annihilate the Syrian army. Second is Turkey has occupation forces in Azaz, Afrin, Idlib, and also their proxies are going to have the influence in Aleppo, in Idlib, and in Homs. So Aleppo, Idlib, Homs is going to be the new Hatay. Hatay was called Skandaron, Liwa Skandaron. And this was 90 years ago, I believe, the French gifted this territory to the Turkish state. And the French were not like the Brits when they gifted half the country of Palestine to the settlers, from Zionist settlers. It wasn't their territory to give it to anyone. But the French did that also in the Syrian territory of Liwa Skandaron and gave it to Turkey. And then it was Turkified and Turkey annexed it. This is going to be the case in Aleppo. It will be Turkified, like it's happening now in Jarablus, in Azaz, in Afrin. And this will lead into a country which has, in the north, Turkey is the colonial power. In the south, it's Israel as a colonial power. And the US on the sides of the Kurds as a colonial power. So the country will be divided into different spheres of influence at the beginning. And also Russia is going to have the colonial power over the coast, because Latakia and Tartus is very important for Russia. It has a navy there. So each country is securing its own interests instead of serving the interests of the people, regardless it is Russia or America or Israel or Turkey. The only power that I believe lost completely in this are the Syrian people, and the Iranians have withdrawn from Syria. So we have this first thing, it's already, we can see it, is the case with the foreign interference. Second is the democracy. Now, we see already the transitional government is headed by a guy whose major is Sharia law. I truly want to understand how can someone whose major is Sharia law can lead a political transitional government, and for us to expect him to create a civil, democratic, let's say, ruling system.
If I could just pause there, just so people understand. You're referring to, I believe his name is Mohammed al-Bashir.
Yeah.
And today, December 10th, there was an announcement that he has been appointed the interim prime minister of Syria, what remains of Syria. And yes, he also happens to have an engineering degree, but as I understand it, you're quite right. His particular expertise happens to be Sharia law. So I just wanted to add that context for our viewers. Please go ahead.
And most importantly, Dimitri, now these militants who occupy 2/3 of Syria, in exception for the Kurdish areas, mostly the rest of the areas, it's HTS, Islamic Turkestan Army. So I will tell you how the situation is in the streets. Today in Damascus, in a Christian neighborhood, the Islamic Turkestan Army, with all these Toyota trucks, carrying the Al-Qaeda flag, they are just roaming the streets and firing in the skies. And those are not Syrians. They are Uyghurs, they are Tajikis, they are Uzbekis, they are from Central Asian countries. So this is a clear provocation. Today, a Syrian journalist, she's a woman from Christian, she is a Christian journalist, and she posted a video telling people, look, you've been following me for 12 years. On my social media accounts. Was there any time that I told you about my religion? Most of you do not even know that I'm a Christian. But I'm coming now and saying that I'm Christian because today the militants of HTS, they stopped me in the street and they saw me uncovered. My hair is uncovered, and they started asking me, what religion do I belong to? And this question I was never asked before, and I reject to answer this question. This is what she says. There are countless videos coming from Latakia and Homs of summary executions of people who belong to the Alawite sect. And the accusations are very ready. And they're saying like, oh, you're a collaborator with the Assad regime. You are a shabih, which means a government thug. So you were killing our children, this and that. Like, there is no trial. There is nothing happening there. You're just holding people and telling us those were collaborating with the Syrian regime and executing them. And because they are from the Alawite sect. And the same thing happened in Homs. We have 2 cases today from Hama and Damascus, a public execution, but hanging, not with weapons, because they say they were collaborating with the Assad regime. Okay, if somebody committed a crime under the Assad regime, I would like to see him standing in front of the court. And in Syria, execution is legal under the constitution. So you can even execute him, this person, if he committed a crime, right? But this is not the case. It has become like a jungle, and everybody can decide if you have been a murderer or not. Mm-hmm. And I, myself, I'm a Syrian. I'm an ethnic Armenian and Christian. It's already like very controversial for them. And imagine that they also think that I'm pro-Assad. This is what they think. Now imagine if I was in Aleppo and they conquered this city. What would have been my fate? And this is also a question to the German government, who tried to deport me to Aleppo, saying, oh, Aleppo is safe, go to Aleppo. Well, nothing will happen to you. What could have happened to me? It would be a public execution, right? This is how is the case. And this doesn't negate all the flaws of the Assad regime. And he has been consistently refusing to find a political settlement, which led to this mess at the moment. And I would like to tell to the people, those who think that I was pro-Assad, I was pro-Syrian sovereignty and territorial integrity and its geopolitical position in the region. And I rejected this foreign insurgency because I predicted and I foresaw what's going to happen, which is already happening right now. But it's very difficult to speak this truth nowadays on, let's say, social media, because everybody is now very hyped and they are caught in these emotions and thinking like this is leading into positive change. And I truly hope, and I promised everyone, I wrote a big post about this and I said, look, I'm not a foreign-funded oppositionist. Now I'm on the opposition side and you are in the government. But I will never, ever harm the national interests of Syria or people's interests. I'm not here to try to find obstacles in the forming of the new government or the regime, but I will vehemently reject this type of governance. If it's going to be based on a religion or one color and all these multinational terrorists are going to execute people in the streets, I reject it. I reject its premise. I reject that Syria is like this, but this is the outcome that they wanted for Syria. Now, why they wanted this outcome? Because for 2 reasons. One, they will create, we have different militant groups, HTS, NSA, FSA, Islamic Turkestan Army, Islam's Army, all these groups are funded and supported by different countries. And the experience of the past years have shown to us that in the same geographical area, when there were groups, a group funded by Saudi Arabia and a group funded by Qatar, they were fighting each other. They were both anti-Assad, but they were fighting each other. There is a famous article, you can find it, I think it's in the New York Times. It says, a militant group funded by the Pentagon is fighting a militant group funded by the CIA in Syria. It's like 2 of them funded by the same source fighting against each other. You know, and this is going to be the case because everyone thinks that they are the stronger party and these militant groups are going to clash sooner or later in the country. And this will create the following 2 scenarios. One, it's going to create the impression to the Syrian people that peace and security and stability is impossible in one united Syria. So each religion and sect has its own entity. So the Kurds take a share, the Sunnis take a share, the Shia and the Alawites take a share, and the Christians live with them, and the Druze go to Israel. This is what they're planning for. And if this plan doesn't work, then the US will present itself as the savior of the Syrian people and coming to save them from the HTS terrorism. And this was the case so many times that the US supports terrorists and or allows the emergence of a terrorist group to find a perfect excuse and justification to invade that country later to say that I'm liberating the people. And I'm going to give just a quick example, hypothetically. If this HTS now controls all of Syria and they start persecuting the Christians, for example, and the Christian persecution has become too obvious for the mainstream press to ignore it, right? And when a decision is given to the mainstream press to cover this case, every single mainstream media will cover it, although this persecution is ongoing for 14 years now. But if it is politically convenient for them, they will focus on this case and they will say that we have to intervene to protect the Christians of Syria. And if the Americans intervene, or even Israel intervenes, the Christians or other minorities will see Israel and the US as liberators because they were persecuted for a long time by these HTS terrorists. So anything is better than HTS for them. And this is how they create fence in the country, in Syria. This is, I believe, one of these scenarios are going to happen sooner or later. Another bold prediction, give it 3 to 5 years, Syria will normalize relations with Israel. There will be an Israeli flag in Damascus, and all this region will be dominated by Israel and the US.
So I'm going to play devil's advocate here for a moment. I think that what you just predicted is entirely plausible. I think that is a realistic, possible scenario. But I think that there is also another possible scenario. Part of my view about this, Kervork, was influenced, although I already had sort of come to this conclusion myself, by an interview that Larry Johnson, former CIA analyst Larry Johnson, gave yesterday on Dialogue Works. And he talked about the inherent uncertainty and volatility of the current situation. You have a number of groups, militant armed groups on the ground. It's not just HTS. You have the Kurdish forces. You have secular, essentially Syrian forces. You have Turkey's interests, Israel's interests, and the United States' interests, which overlap but are not necessarily entirely compatible. You still have people on the ground who are, of course, sympathetic to the resistance to the plight of the Palestinian people. And there's no effective government in Syria. The military has been completely annihilated. And even if its military assets had not been utterly obliterated by Israel over the last few days, you had an army which was effectively incapable of fighting as a coherent unit. And so in this scenario, I have real doubts about the ability of anybody to control the outcome. And what we effectively have now is a state descending into chaos that is saturated with weapons, where there's a lot of anger, very disparate agendas, and it's in the heart of the richest oil-producing region in the world, where big powers have great interests. So I would suggest that perhaps it's very premature of any of us to make any predictions about how this is going to play out. One might argue that Israel, the United States, and Turkey have created a monster that they're no longer able to control. Do you think that that is also a possible outcome of all of this, that this descends into a state of chaos, which ultimately does severe damage, not just to the resistance, but to the very powers who provoked this chaos?
First of all, even if there is no chaos now in Syria, let's suppose that HTS has a firm grip over every state institution and they succeed in creating a democratic state and the scenarios that they are selling now in the press. Syrian army capabilities are destroyed. So even if HTS wants to use these weapons, there is none. Secondly, HTS, who is going to sell the weapons to HTS? It's going to be Turkey, it's going to be United States, and these are going to be NATO gears, and they are in no way or shape going to be used against Israel. And this is the same thing they do with the Lebanese army. They give all these weapons to the Lebanese army and they say, but with the condition that you have to sign that you cannot use this weapon against Israel. So this is going to be the case in Syria. Even if HTS wants to, they will not be able to do it. And if it happens, then they will be considered terrorist organization and Israel will expand even more in Syrian territories like they already do now. Now, will this chaos spill over into other countries? That's a very good question. And that's a very good theory, by the way, by Larry Johnson. I would suspect that if this spillovers, it could spill over to Jordan. And I think it's in Israel's interest to destabilize Jordan, something that the Jordanian state, I'm not sure they're aware of it, but they don't act like they're aware of it. I think that the Israelis want to create instability in Jordan and force it into a deal. This is called the centuries deal. The centuries deal is basically to create one state, Israel, in Palestine, and ethnically cleanse the Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza to Jordan. 60%, I believe, of the Jordanian people are already Palestinians. Maybe don't quote me on this, but a big percentage of them are Palestinians. Mm-hmm. And this is how Israelis see the end of the Israel-Palestine conflict. First is the disarmament of the destruction of the powerful Arab armies, mainly Iraq and Syria, after neutralizing the Egyptian army after the Camp David Accords. And now the Saudis and the Emiratis are leading this wave of normalizations in the region, and they had to do something about Syria because it stands between this grand bargain or the grand compromise in the region. And therefore, the Saudis and the Emiratis played a role in engineering the coup or the insurgency from the beginning. So I would argue that since Saudi Arabia and the Emirates are going to have a big influence and leverage over Damascus, they're the ones who are going to lead this normalizing ties with Israel. And in parallel, we will see more violence against the Palestinians in Gaza. We will see another round of confrontation with Hezbollah in order to try to degrade the strength of Hezbollah even more, because, they cannot really destroy Hezbollah, but if they further degrade the strength of Hezbollah and also localize it, because now the supply chains are cut and with Syria, and also Hezbollah doesn't have this access to Syria and eventually to Iraq and Iran, which means Hezbollah becomes a local player and not a regional player like it used to be. So if you destroy Gaza and localize Hezbollah and cut the supply chains and also neutralize the Syrian army, then you will have an upper hand over the region. And the Saudis and the Emiratis will be so happy now under the Trump administration to persuade the Syrian government or the upcoming Syrian government to normalize ties with Israel, something that I speculate that it's going to happen in the next 3 to 5 years. And it's not irrational to think about it or unrealistic. This was the case all the way. And this is why Assad was fought against to begin with. And that's why the blame for Assad is even bigger and bigger and bigger for promising the people to withstand and be steadfast and resist this foreign-funded insurgency for a better outcome. And then at the end of the day, he escaped in the middle of the night and leaving his people in complete, let's say, misery, and also geopolitically tearing apart the country and complete destruction of the Syrian army. This is unforgivable, it's treasonous, and it cannot be justified in any way or shape. Any president wants to leave his constitutional duties, comes and tells the people, honestly, look, I served this country, I made mistakes, like any politician does. I'm grateful for my people who supported me, and I'm sorry for the people who hate me and if I harmed anyone. And now it's time for a settlement because my presence is divisive and we are unable to open up to the rest of the world because of the sanctions and many of the political measures against us. And because I care about the Syrian people, now I will give my authorities to the prime minister. The prime minister leads 6 months of transitional period and then elections. And when elections happen, I leave the country because I don't want to be a divisive figure here or a reason for the sanctions to continue. And that's how I give up my authorities to secured or in a place where you can preserve the state institutions, the military, and we don't see all these summary executions in the streets and Israel just bombing anything it wants in the country. It's just unimaginable anyone who would do this. So I'm very upset. I'm very upset for what Assad did. It's just it
I
can't
agree.
be any worse. It
I
can't be
agree.
any worse.
I agree. But I come back to my question. Completely concur with your assessment of Assad. But I still have a significant degree of doubt that the United States, Israel, and Turkey are going to be able to control this monster. They didn't. They weren't able to. The United States made great efforts to pacify the Iraqi population,
Yes.
and we saw what the outcome of that was. And now there is an uneasy, tenuous peace in Iraq. The United States is the dominant power within the region, but they're not able to prevent, even to this very day, popular militias, which are pro-Iranian, from operating in the country, attacking military bases there. The country has moved towards a more Iraq. I'm referring to the government has a more pro-Iranian position that it had certainly under
Yes.
Saddam Hussein. So there have been unintended consequences in Iraq that were negative to the American project of a hegemony. And this seems to me to be an even more volatile situation here in Syria that we have now. So and by the way, when it comes to supplying the Islamic resistance, another interesting thing that Larry Johnson said, he acknowledged readily that it's going to be much more difficult for Iran to supply Hezbollah, but he said that in the very chaotic conditions that are now going to prevail in Syria for quite some time, it is possible for Iran to open up smuggling routes and to continue to supply at least some weaponry to the Islamic resistance. I mean, when you have a desperate, impoverished population, I would imagine it wouldn't be too difficult to find people who are willing to help you smuggle weapons to Lebanon in exchange for, significant compensation. Not even he is completely writing off the ability of Iran to continue to supply Hezbollah. Hezbollah, I'm sure, also has some domestic weapons production capability, although it's not going to be able to produce hugely destructive guided missiles, I would imagine, but certainly it can produce some weaponry locally. So it seems to me that what we have here is a recipe for extreme violence heading on into the future for some indefinite period of time, which is going to ultimately work to the disadvantage of everybody. Uh,
Yes.
I happen to think that's the most plausible scenario, that rather than a scenario in which Israel and the United States successfully pacify Syria, in the next year or two. That seems to me to be
Yes.
quite unlikely.
But you know what's going to happen, Dimitri? You're 100% correct on this. There is also an aspect, for example, Syria is a multi-ethnic, multicultural country, or multi-religious, let's say. So if you live in Sweden Governorate, and Sweden Governorate is mostly populated by the Jews, and if you don't have this type of militias in your place, in your governorate, and you don't allow them because it's in the hands of local militias now, mostly Jews, right? And therefore, this type of spillover, it's not going to arrive into the Sweden, but when they see that the regional or the neighboring governorates are in mess and there is lots of militias killing each other, this is going to be the time when people will say that we want to separate from Syria and become like an independent enclave, or federalism, or even opening routes to Israel, because Golan Heights is populated by the Jews, and some of the Jewish people, they already accepted the occupation of Israel. And this could be also the case in Sweden. And I would like for the people to also Google this. There is a congressman from the Republican side, I forgot his name, but he's in daily touch with the Jewish community in Syria, and he's encouraging them for this scenario. So and already there are voices from there saying that we want to join Israel. So I think that some of the minorities in Syria, especially the Alawites and the Christians and the Jews, to be very, very difficult for them to coexist with this type of mentality. And this will encourage them to create their own enclaves, like mini states inside Syria, like to balkanize it, right? But you're completely right, because the rest of the country, which is basically from the north Aleppo to the south of Daraa, everything in between, it's going to be a cocktail of different shades and forms of these jihadi groups. And these people are they're chaotic. They are very, I would say, militaristic, and there is always a motivation for them to continue fighting. So when you're really ideologically driven, it's endless for you. The fighting is endless. So it doesn't stop in Syria unless a state is formed and takes away all the weapons. But the state is HTS, and HTS itself is a gang. So it's like expecting from a gang to build a state is unrealistic. It's naive. Yeah. And it hurts me to see progressives, left wings, people who champion democracy, basically. One of which is your, I don't want to mention names now, but your countryman, he's celebrating the regime change in Syria. I understand why you're celebrating it, but you know that what's going to be the outcome of this. Like we have to learn a little bit from the past experiences.
Mm. I'm curious to know who that countryman is. But if
he was a former minister of finance in your country.
Oh, Varoufakis, my God. Yes, I know. So, Varoufakis, I also have some complaints with Varoufakis in terms of his attitude towards Russia. But in any case, sometimes even the most intelligent of us make ourselves into useful idiots, and Yanis Varoufakis sometimes.
Oh my God! And he received lots of backlash on X, and
yeah.
It's just.
So let's turn to HTS, because I think you've already answered my question, but I just want to put a finer point on this, Kervork. This head chopping extremist sectarian terrorist organization, whose leader has a $10 million bounty on his head from the CIA, and which has for years now been ranked in the top 10 terrorist organizations in West Asia by the U.S. government itself. We're being told that it's moderated its point of views, and it's become an inclusive and diverse organization, and they've opted for peaceful coexistence. I take it that you are skeptical about that narrative. Is that fair?
I'm not skeptical at all. Next year, he's going to be declared as an ally for the LGBT community as well. Like wonders happen by the mainstream press there. But this shows you who is behind Jolani and who is the handler. And it's quite clear that it's the democratic wing of the establishment in the US. And this diversity talk, tolerance, it's all this selling points to promote the democratic, neoliberal democratic system around the world. Yeah. And I think CNN meeting with Jolani is not a coincidence. CNN is the mouthpiece of the democratic wing of the establishment. So in the US, and meeting him in Aleppo, in a declared place without any bodyguards or security, I mean, I'm sure everybody knows where Jolani is at the moment, but nobody wants to kill him somehow. Even the Russians. It's like, I thought this guy was a terrorist, and he just marched from Aleppo to Damascus. He was in the Aleppo citadel. He was in the Damascus Umayyad Mosque. And he was just walking in the streets and giving interviews. So I think nobody wants to kill him now. I wonder why. Although for those who have his location, there is a $10 million bounty, guys, on his head. So that would be maybe motivation for some people to send his location, to these countries. Yeah,
I think whether the CIA will actually pay out the $10 million at this stage.
I seriously suspect. I think that they will ignore the information and they will not do anything about it. But I'm sure everybody knows where he is, especially Israel. And there are so many people accompanying him with smartphones and cameras, and we know how Israel spies on anyone and everyone especially if in such groups, they follow everything and they know where he is. But they will not kill him at the moment. He still has some job to do, still to enforce the what they call Islamic rule on the country. And then when his job is over, you will see he disappears, just like Abu Bakr Baghdadi and Osama bin Laden. And then they will throw his body into the ocean so nobody can know if he's alive or dead.
100%. He's a dead man walking.
Yeah.
They'll use him and spit him out like a piece of gum. And his time is coming, but apparently he continues to have some use for the Zionist entity and its Western backers. Now, I know you've had a long day, and I don't want to keep you much longer, but I do want to ask you one last question, and it's the same last question that I asked you. We had you on the program a couple of weeks ago, and that is, what do you think Iran is going to do next, and what do you think it ought to do? So let's start with what it ought to do. Given the current circumstances, what do you think Iran is it? And let me be clear what I say when I say ought to do. What I am asking you is put yourself in the mind of an Iranian and ask yourself what is in the best interest of the people of Iran.
Exactly. This is the case.
Well, from that perspective, what do you think they ought to do? And then what do you think they actually will do, the government?
I will give you a context because the foreign minister of Iran was in Damascus a few weeks ago. This was not the last one, the one before. And he heard from Damascus back then that if you don't want to increase your direct participation in this war in Lebanon, this is going to have a spillover to Syria. And if you're not ready to do the fight, then let's agree on a ceasefire agreement. And this was after the assassination of Nasrallah and the leadership. And the Iranians were clear that they don't want to participate in a direct war with Israel. They don't want to participate in a war against the United States. Therefore, the ceasefire agreement was reached in Lebanon because Iran also refused to up until this moment to carry out the Operation Promise 3. So Iran preferred its national interests, its local interests, its people. And I'm not blaming them. I'm not saying that they shouldn't have done that because every politician should care about his own people first. But when Iran leads an axis, an alliance of state and non-state actors, and it's the strongest force, it's the leading force of this axis, it is expected from the bigger ally of this axis to increase its participation when there are acts of hostilities, not only with Israel, but also with the entire collective West, because the entire collective West has came to support Israel. The United States has given unconditional support to Israel in its genocide against the Palestinians, right? But Iran's support was not unconditional like the United States. Therefore, if you want to lead an axis, you need to play your roles as well. But if you reject to play your role, and the Israelis hit what they call the hands of the octopus, starting from Gaza, moving to Lebanon, and now in Syria, then the axis of resistance is over. And the role of Iran, the expanded role of Iran in the region is also over. And I would assume, just in my humble opinion, that Iran read the geopolitics, the global geopolitics, and saw that Trump is coming and Trump is trying to freeze the conflict in Ukraine or find a deal with the Russians. And if that is going to be the case, Trump is not going to go to war against China. That's impossible. But they can and still want to harm Iran to the maximum. And if they do that, they will hit the third leg of the Eurasian region. They will decouple between Russia and Iran, and they will decouple between Russia and between China and Iran. And China is the biggest importer of the Iranian fuel. So Iranians read that as a serious threat, and that this could lead into massive attack on Iran itself. So they backed off, and they preferred their national interests, and they gave up basically on Syria and on Lebanon. And now they went back to their previous line, and that was like the line we used to know 20 or 30 years ago. But now Iran, if this is going to be the case, and there is going to be a deal with Russia, between Russia and the United States, Iran will not be antagonized because in a massive way, because Iran doesn't have any longer means to harm Israel directly. So in this case, Iran can open up to the rest of the world, relieve some of its sanctions and liberate some of its billions and take care of its people. But this case creates mistrust now with Iran. So in the future, if local players like in Lebanon or Syria, let's say the situation has changed in the region, Iran wants to represent itself again as a leading power for certain resistance against the US dominance in the region, I think people will not trust Iran to put their eggs in this axis. If the serious time comes, then Iran will back off for its interests. So I'm not blaming them, but at the same time, I'm saying that I don't think they will be able to recreate its axis of resistance. In the contrary, Turkey will be the leading power in the region now. And that's, of course, it's dangerous for you guys also in Greece. And Turkey is going to be extremely powerful. And one of the reasons for it is because Turkey is a Sunni country. And Erdogan presents itself as the leader of the Sunni people who says, you guys were persecuted for a long time. Look what happened to you in Iraq. Look what Bashar Assad did to you. Now I'm coming here as your savior. And he's among his supporters in Syria. He is named the Sultan of the Muslims in Syria. But this is also, what do we say about the circle of history? After every war, the first generation lives the war, the second generation remembers the war, and then the third generation forgets the war. And I think many Syrians in the third generation, unlike the Armenians, because we inherit these sentiments against the Ottomanism, many people in Syria have forgotten that the Ottomans occupied them for 400 years and subjugated them, humiliated them, and they used all sorts of cruel means to humiliate their people. And now it's the third generation. It seems the people have forgotten, and they have invited again another Turkish occupation of their country, and they will regret big time because Turkey doesn't see them as equals. Turkey never treats the Arabs as equals. And the level of racism in Turkey is so high against the Arab people that even tourists, you see these videos of Arab tourists in Istanbul being beaten up because they're speaking Arabic. They don't understand these things, but maybe, just maybe, I'm saying that people, then if you don't learn from this historical past, then history repeats itself. And that's why this is the only relief I have, because I'm so much in pain, Dimitri, for what's happened to my country in the past 14 years. But I also feel that I did my duty to enlighten the people, try to explain. But if the people do not listen to you, what can you do about it? You have to back off. You have to back off and take care of your family and take care of your personal affairs. And that's it, because everyone has also a capacity and a limit in his capacity and energy to present. We have lived 14 years from our physical health, from mental health. I think it's enough. So I leave this to the people, to this, whoever is managing the affairs. And if people want to learn from it, learn from it. If not, because people who do not learn from the mistakes, they perish. Yeah. So they have to be wise enough to keep their nation alive. If not, many nations perished in the past. So this would be my advice for them, to be awake and alarmed against this foreign intervention.
Here, Kervork. Our highest obligation is to act in accordance with our conscience. And that's all that can be asked of us. And with that, I thank you very much for taking the time to speak with me today. And hopefully we'll have better news to discuss in our next conversation.
I really hope so. Thank you so much, Dimitri.
And this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Montreal for Reason to Exist on December 10th, 2024.